That being said, it's sort of amazing how UK season 2 was directly affected by the pandemic because there was a full 7-month pause.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right, I have 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Thumbs up, you can hear me? Okay. There's somebody who was getting on I don't see them, so I'll keep an eye out. Sorry. All right, welcome everyone. We are in week 3, and we are talking about Minjung art in South Korea, which is during the 1980s. So to start off, I want to give some plenary session response feedback since you submitted your first one last Friday. Everyone who submitted one should have their grade now, even if you submitted it late. So we were kind of all over the place. So please review your specific feedback. If you do not address the issues, or I do not see that you tried to address the issues that I brought to your attention for this previous assignment, then you will lose points starting this week for those issues. This week, I only took a point off for if you didn't do the citation correctly, because we had said specifically, we had talked about that a few times already. And that really shouldn't have been something that you didn't do properly. So let's talk about what a description is. So what is a description and why is it important? So let's think back to the visual analysis module and think back to what we were talking about last week when we were describing the different artworks from North Korea, like the statue. Absolutely. What we see, it is what we see. Well, not necessarily what we see, but what you see. What you see. Good. What else? So why is what you see important? Why is that important in a visual analysis? Yes, exactly. Why is Elise the only person who's responding to me right now? Oh, okay, here we go. We got some other people coming in. Visual, okay. So let's see, visual documentation of the image that the audience may not see. So I don't really know what you mean by documentation, but it is like writing what you see with attention to the details, right? So something that if you just look at it really quickly, you're probably not going to pick up on it. But when you actually start doing like a deep look, right, you'll kind of pick up on everything, right? So yeah, so there's one, yes, exactly, good. Return to, exactly, good. Bella and then Elise, these are good. Jared, yes, okay, good. So describing part of why it's important is because you want the person who's reading it, which in this case is me. But what we're trying to do is think like an art historian, like someone who works, who writes about visual, like artworks and things like that, right? You want to help them be able to imagine the artwork for themselves. So the reason is because they may not have access to the image, which someone said here, but the reason is because you're trying to pick up on things that someone who would just look at it really quickly wouldn't pick up on, right? Does that make sense? So I wrote this. So put into words what you see, help the reader imagine the artwork, draw their attention to important parts. And then here's the third one, which, did someone say this? Yeah, which we're explaining the image. Okay. You need these visual, what's going on, what you see, so that when you tell me this artwork is about XYZ, you have evidence. You have what the artwork looks like. You can use that to evidence the fact that that's what the artwork is about, or what it means, or what it's related to, right? So a lot, like many of you did really good job of saying, you know, for example, if you chose a poster, many of you did a good job of saying, you know, this is propaganda because it tells the viewer that the US is bad, right? Okay, well, what do you see in the poster that tells you that? Does that make sense? So that's starting to think like an art historian, think like think visually. Visual thinking is what it is, right? So does that make a little bit more sense? So that's what we want to constantly be thinking about, these three things when we're doing the descriptions. Okay. And if you are someone who struggle with that a little bit, we are practicing. We're going to be doing that a lot today. Anyways, okay. Yes, visual thinking is about putting what you see into words and using what you see to understand whatever you're looking at. That's just visual thinking in general. Yeah, you don't need to know these terms. These are like this is like art education kind of stuff, but that's what we're like doing. That's what you're doing in this class. That's the skill that you're developing in this class. Does that make sense? And yeah, so, we do go over all of these for particular, we didn't last week for the particular artworks. We go over these different aspects, right, of the visual elements, if you remember from the visual analysis module. So make sure you mention something about each of these things. I mean, that's kind of really the easiest way to do the description. Is just, did I say what the medium is? Did I mention what the icons are, what they're doing? Did I talk about the composition a little bit? Did I talk about the perspective, the style, so the colors, the line, the light and shadow, right? Does that make sense? Okay, I'm getting yeses. I think I could tell in our blogs today, especially, that everyone is getting on the right page. So, but I'm gonna go over this a little bit broader. And I think I should have specifically gone over this last week too, so that's partially my fault. But you didn't lose points this past response if you weren't quite getting to where you needed to be. Okay. Oh, the other thing I want to mention is a lot of you, so with the quotes or the citations, so a lot of you put like really long, like 4 or 5, you put like the whole paragraph. Maybe not a lot of you, but quite a few of you. And this is something you'll learn, and this is an academic writing, but you essentially should never really do that unless you're like trying to analyze the paragraph itself. So you shouldn't be putting more than like one line of a quote if you're using a direct quote. And even then, I notice a lot of undergrads especially try and do the direct quotes a lot, but I really would encourage you to try and paraphrase it. So try and put what it says in your own words and just use the citation as like, this person had that idea, which shows me that you really understand what they said. Okay. Yeah, so just not whole another thing I saw is a lot of people put like an entire section. You said like from page 50 to 59 or something like that. Don't do that. It should really just be one page. There should really just be one page number, unless like the sentence or the paragraph goes between 2 pages. That's really the only reason you would need to quote 2. And then, yeah, don't forget the page number. Okay, yeah. All right, so are there any questions about any of this? Quotes, description, or anything? Grades with the plenary response. Good. Okay, great. All right. So let's start talking about, we're going to be talking about demonstrations, protests, political movements the entire time today, because that is really the defining feature of the 20th century in Korea. So the attendance question today, to start us getting to think about it, is, have you seen or been to a demonstration? Have you seen or been to a demonstration? I'm interested to see, because I think some of you were still in high school a few years ago. Just a few years ago. Yes, no, yes, no. And if you want to share what it was, whatever it was you went to, that would be, I would be interested in that as well. You don't have to, but if you'd be interested. So, good. So I have been in, well, when I lived in Columbus, Ohio, I went to demonstrations quite a lot. And I'm somewhere in the back here in this picture for the Black Lives Matter protests that were in Columbus, Ohio, which they got really they got a lot of what's the word, bad publicity, I think, but it was a very big deal in Columbus because Columbus has one of the highest rates of police violence in the entire country. So that's part of the reason why it was so bad. So thinking about demonstrations or movements, what is particularly interesting in Korean history is that this idea of protest, demonstration, and particularly like a nationwide political movement is a very consistent occurrence throughout the 20th century. So one of the earliest was the March First movement. It's called the 3-1 movement in Korean, actually. And that took place in 1919 during the Japanese colonial period. And this became a nationwide movement for Korean independence from Japanese rule. So we'll learn a little bit more about that next week. And then a similar kind of demonstration that evolved into a larger movement happened in June of 1926, which was, I think, actually at the funeral. It started at the funeral of the last prince of Korea. And he was actually the last, he was an emperor technically, but only like a figurehead. And it had the same goal as the earlier movement, independence from Japan is what they were fighting for. So this is known as the June movement or the 610 movement. However, there's another 610 movement, which is during the Minjung movement. So this is actually we call it the first 610 movement. So after independence, though, in South Korea particularly, these movements continued to happen because South Korea was under a constant military dictatorial rule. So these were also begun and led primarily by students. So that's a little bit different as well from earlier. A remarkable movement against the first military dictatorship was in 1960, the April Revolution. And this was against Lee Seung-man or Seung-man Lee, and who was the first major dictator. He had gotten elected as the president in 1948. And this catalyzed the ascent of the next military dictator, Park Chung-hee, because these movement actually led to Lee Seung-man fleeing the country, actually to Hawaii, believe it or not. And so under Park Chung-hee, who we'll talk about in just a moment, that kind of led to the movement that we're going to focus on today, which begins 20 years later. And it was particularly catalyzed by the Gwangju Uprising or the Gwangju Massacre. You also hear Gwangju Movement. There's a lot of different words for it. And it was originally a student protest against martial law under actually the third major dictator, who was Jeon Du-hwan. And so this is what led to the larger Minjung movement of student protests, which climaxed in 1987 with the murder of 2 student protesters at the hands of police, Park Jong-chul and Lee Han-yeol, which led to the major Minjung demonstration of June that year. That's the second 610 movement. And it's this movement that particularly the dictatorial regime, the backlash was so bad that they just decided to give up and hold the free elections in the fall that year. So what exactly seems to be consistent about these demonstrations or movements? What do you notice about them? What are they for, number one? What's like the goal or the premise of them? How are they similar? Do you think they're related to one another? Well, make change is a little too vague, right? Because every demonstration, every political movement wants to make a change, right? But what's the particular change that they want? Democracy, definitely democracy. Definitely democracy. Yes, this is a huge thing. In the case of Korea and South Korea particularly, is students protesting against the government. There's a lot of student-led movements, political movements. Good. What else? Anything else? The military, yes, exactly. Against the military is always on the government side, right? There's always this military conflict between civilians and the military, right? Good. Limited time. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Although they happen a lot, really, if you think about it, they do only occur within a month or two, right? So that's something to think about as well about these demonstrations. Like if we think about, I mean, 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement is just in recent mind, right? That was really, it was during the summer and into the fall, right? But now, I mean, sure, there are probably protests or demonstrations related to it that pop up here and there, but it was really during this limited time, retrospectively, that it was kind of all condensed into, right? Yeah, people died in all of them. Yeah, that's very important to remember as well. Good. So yeah, I had wrote down, sorry, I have so many different things on this slide. Yeah, self-rule is one of the big things, right? Is this democratic ideal that they're fighting for the people to have rule for themselves. Okay. So are there any similar, can you think of any similar moments in the modern US or global history, particularly recently? I think there's one in particular in the United States that's a conflict between the US military and students. Has anyone ever heard of it? It was in the 1970s. So it was during the Vietnam War. The protest was against the Vietnam War. There we go. Yes, good. Kent State. So that's kind of the big one here. So this is a really famous photo. That is that, this woman, obviously very distressed because her friend or someone, a student, is lying dead after having been shot by the National Guard, right? So these students were protesting the Vietnam War in the US military, and then of course they just used the US military to quell them. So that day lives in infamy, right? You notice it's also in May 1970, which is kind of interesting. A lot of protests actually happened during the summer, which kind of makes sense. What about, there's another one. There's one place in the world right now where they are really fighting for democracy to get democracy and maintain it. In East Asia, I should say, in East Asia. Tiananmen, yes, Tiananmen is definitely one, like that. Syria, the civil war. So I don't know enough about it to say, but I'm sure it's very similar. I was thinking about Hong Kong, and I think maybe some of you were not. I was in my first master's during this time, so we talked about this a lot. So these are actually starting to blow up again now that COVID has really lessened in the area. And so it's for the same idea, for people to have their own rule for themselves, to be able to elect their own representatives. And particularly these were bought for, Hong Kong didn't want criminals to be extradited, to be put under the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China, because the actual like criminal, what counts as a criminal offense are a little bit different between the two. Particularly the issue was people who were activists for democracy would be harshly, they would be indicted and harshly charged under PRC law versus Hong Kong law. So the person who's leading up to this issue, the Minju movement, is this guy, Park Chung-hee. So what were some things about him that really stuck out to you from the reading? The Robinson reading in particular talks about him. Why is he such a big deal? What's so important about him? Is my internet slow? Did we not read this? Let's see. We don't remember anything about him? Influence, that's what I get. Yes, he did get assassinated. Good, yeah, okay. So Park Chung-hee is probably the most ambiguous and controversial figure in Korean history, especially in South Korea. Every person in South Korea has a different opinion on him and in his legacy. He rose to power, let's see, yes, he rose to power by staging a coup after the first military dictator, Lee Seung-man, had fallen, and he fled. And so Park is truly the reason that South Korea is industrially and economically looks the way that it does today. So he implemented, during the 1960s particularly, he implemented major economic reforms, which led to what people call now the Miracle on the Han River. And this is what really brought South Korea into the global market. And Park geared the economy toward the policies themselves were about gearing the economy towards exporting manufactured goods. So if you're exporting stuff, you're sending it out, right? And a lot of the stuff that it was these heavy industry, such as like ships and machinery. And the primary people who they were exporting it to were the US, Europe, and Japan, right? And so his primary political ideology was anti-communism. His regime implemented nationwide educational and cultural programs geared towards developing a Korean national identity that posited South Korea as the superior Korea against North Korea, which was communist socialist, right? And he normalized relations with Japan, which is still a very controversial issue, and received support from the US. And that's how he was able to stay in power for so long, was because the United States, particularly the US military, really supported him. But he got power hungry, and in the 1970s, he established a new constitution that gave him sole reign as the president of South Korea for unlimited terms, which obviously did not sit well, even with his own regime. And he was actually assassinated by the head of the Korean CIA, whom he had appointed. So his own administration actually turned on him for this. So what do you think? Good guy or bad guy here? Because this is a topic that everyone talks about over and over again. Good guy or bad guy? Bad guy, both. Good guy gone bad. Mostly bad, gray, both. Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to judge. On the one hand, the economic development is really important. On the other hand, we'll see later that the economic development does come at a price, right? So we'll see. Yeah, what he achieved has been important, but that doesn't mean everything he did was good. It's not just him, really. That's the other thing about it is, we always in history we always focus on like the figurehead, right? But he had this whole administration of people who were in charge of different aspects, and he was just kind of like the leader, right? So that's another thing to think about. But yeah, I mean, literally everyone has a very different opinion on him. I tend to think gray, maybe leaning a little bit closer to the bad side, but it's up to you. And yes, Jay had direct messaged me. He is actually the father of the recent president of Korea named Park Geun-hye, who was what's that word? Impeached. Thank you. I'm like, wait, what is that? Yes, impeached. She was impeached in 2016, very recently, for bribery and fraud, maybe. So Yeah, exactly. It really is the constitutional change is really what screwed it up. If he hadn't done that, I do think that we would view him as this very magnanimous kind of leader for sure. Yeah, but he definitely has a cult following though still. There are many people in South Korea who really love him and think he was like the greatest leader in the world. So all right, so let's talk about Gwangju. So basically all this is leading towards Gwangju, right? Especially his assassination. So after his assassination, the person who got the next person, main person, was Jeon Do-hwan. And he was only slightly less dictatorial than Park Chung-hee. So in December 1979, Jeon instigated a coup to take power, and then he initiated martial law over the entire country on May 16th, 1980. So on May 18th, students at Cheonnam University in Gwangju, which is South Jeolla province, were holding demonstrations against the martial law when the military police attempted to stop them with force. But the police also ended up attacking the spectating civilians while trying to stop the demonstrations. So the civilians ended up having to join in the fight to defend themselves, right, against the police. So the Gwangju students and civilians managed to hold the military back for about 9 days until the police retook control of the city on the 27th of May. And in the end, over 200 civilians were either dead or missing, 3,000 were wounded, and over 1,300 were arrested. So you can imagine that this very small demonstration really blew up. You know, these are huge numbers for just, if you think about one city, right? And this happens there. And one of the issues, and several of you talked about this in your blog post as well, was what was the extent of the US influence in this issue? And that is still up for debate, but it is pretty much, there's really good evidence to show that it's a little bit hard to tell, which is a little bit weird, but so I'm just gonna read this quote to you. This is what I've boxed and read here. So this is from the ambassador to South Korea from the United States. And so he said, I said that the policy decisions of May 17th had staggered us. We agreed that firm anti-riot measures were necessary, but the accompanying political crackdown was political folly and clearly had contributed to the serious breakdown of order in Gwangju. And then later on in number 5, he says, the United States is doing all it can to help in the restoration of order. I continued, we have agreed to chop forces under the CFC command, which is the combined US-South Korea military forces, to Korean authorities for use in Gwangju. So what do you think? Based on this is like really the biggest piece of evidence that there was some communication about the incident and the US did have an opinion prior, but do you think based on this, what does it seem like the US kind of involvement in the issue in the Gwangju massacre really was? So do you think that this indicates that the US was directly involved, or what was kind of the US take on what went down in Gwangju in Gwangju in May of 1980? Yeah, the US wasn't really directly involved, but they did advise them. Yes, that's the thing, is they so what this is basically saying, or how I interpret it, is that the CFC, so the combined US South Korean military forces, did contact and consider US advice on how to handle the situation. But the US advice supported anti-riot measures, right? Or getting involved, the military getting involved. But this is not, yeah, this is not exactly what they had in mind, but then they were really ambiguous in the first place, right? So yeah, they weren't really, there was some miscommunication, or I think just they were probably upset that it got out of hand, more than that they actually used the military force that they did. So it's up to you how you want to interpret it. I tend to think that it's involved, but with a little bit of ambiguity. Yeah, I really think it's the US clearly was like, yeah, you need to use the military and like stop this. But at the same time, but then it's just like the result of it is what they actually really regretted, right? It's like what they're actually like, oh, that was not good, right? So they're trying to get back for it. Good. All right. And so this is how we get to the Minjung movement. So the Minjung movement is the 1980s movement for democratization in South Korea. So I need you to remember this because you will be asked at some point, what is the purpose of the Minjung movement? We're going to talk about the goals in a moment, but students list all these different concerns and goals of Minjung, but they never list democracy as one of them. This was the major goal of the Minjung movement. They wanted free elections. They wanted to elect their representatives in the government. It's a response to these authoritarian regimes and the labor conditions brought about by the Park Chung-hee era. And I just want to comment this on really quick because students tend to get really interested in what the word actually means. So Min just means the people or people generally, and Jung means gathering in this case. So people translate it as the common people, as the masses, as the people, as Korean people. You hear that too. It means Korean people. It's a very loaded term that has a very long history, much longer than this, from the early 20th century. So don't get too focused on like what it means exactly. Just say Minjung or people. You can say Minjung or peoples. I think peoples is kind of fine or fine enough. I prefer not common people, even though I know that's what Charlotte Horlick says in her reading, because it's not just the common people that they're referring to here. Oh yeah, I did see that. Jay just was telling me that Jeon Doo-hwan's grandson actually apologized to the victims' families of the Gwangju massacre. Yeah, this has been a continuous process of lament and apology and trying to make up for it. Good. But yeah, so the reason I don't necessarily like common people is because although it's made up primarily of students and intellectuals, there were working class people and laborers in the protests. And so it's quite a mixture of people, not just the quote unquote common people. There were elites, privileged people in privileged classes, people not in privileged classes, all sorts of people involved. And then the goals or concerns of the Minjung movement. So again, number one is democracy. Do not forget that. You will need to say that at some point. Number two, freedom of speech and expression, right? So they've been under oppression. They're not allowed to say what they think, right? So very important. Workers' rights, absolutely important. Reunification of the Korean Peninsula, and liberation from US American cultural imperialism, particularly to save Korean traditions. So there's this conflict going on between what is viewed as like the foreign imperial and the native traditional, okay? So there's this kind of conflict going on. So the climax. So there were two major deaths that led to the climax of the Minjung movement in 1987. So the first was in January, and it was the torture and murder of a student from Seoul National University named Park Jong-chul. And he was, I'm sorry, Park Jong-chul. Yeah, chul it should be. That should be a apostrophe. He was taken into custody by Seoul police to be questioned about the whereabouts of another student activist whose name was Park Jong-un on the 14th, and to get Park to talk to the police. I'm sorry. And the police waterboarded him to get him to talk about the whereabouts of this other activist. and he ended up dying from being waterboarded. So I'm not sure exactly how, but the national news actually got wind of this really quickly and started reporting on it on the 15th, the very next day. So as you can imagine, this really blew up quickly. But later that year in June, during the student protests on the 9th of June, another student named Lee Han-yeol was hit by a police tear gas canister and he was thrown into a coma. He was a Yonsei University student and he was taken to the hospital and he died a month later on July 5th. But the fervor from this situation continued throughout the month and eventually the demonstrations overwhelmed the police. Chun Doo-hwan, there we go. Yeah, Chun Doo-hwan was also under pressure from the United States to not use military force this time to quell the movement. So the regime announced officially on June 29th that they would cede and hold free elections later that year. So, and the person who ended up being elected, which I find very interesting, is Noteu, who was actually Chun's selected successor. So he was affiliated with the regime, but he got elected anyways. And this is probably because he's actually the one who delivered the proclamation for the free elections on June 29th. And the free elections happened in October that year. So it seemed to help him out in getting elected. So what we see here, though, especially with the deaths of these two students, is here that visual culture is integral to protest. Why? Why is it so important to have these kinds of artworks or things to look at when we're protesting something? What do you think? Influence. How so? Why is it a big influence? Yeah, they could be seen and distributed. Yes, distribution. Distribution is very important. You need something to help people see what you're fighting for, right? And yes, it triggers feelings. That's a really good way to put it. When you see something like this, it triggers you to think and to feel something, right? Good. Absolutely. Tug on their hearts. It's this emotional response. Good. Yeah, it's another way of communicating your ideas for sure. Put it on buildings. That again goes with the publicity, emotional side. Yeah, this is good too. They have this symbol or shortcut for the larger ideas that are going on, right? So maybe you have all these different goals for your movement, but in one quick image or one image, you can sum it all together and someone sees it and can know what it is you're fighting for, right? Very good. So defining Minjung art. So let's talk about what kinds of art seem to be in this large category of Minjung art. What do you notice about it? What did Charlotte Horlick and Maya Stiller say about what's kind of really important about Minjung art? What kinds of art? Good. Political and economic, socioeconomic, yeah. Printmaking, one of them. Traditional Korean art, protest art, printmaking. Right. So all these different kinds of, so there's all these different kinds of art, right? So you have art, excuse me. So you have these prints and the banners that are particularly for like the protests, right? To get out into space and distribute things, right? Or to let everyone see it, right? And then you have other things like paintings, and there's actually sculpture too that's related to it. But that's more for like galleries that are in solidarity with the Minjung movement and Minjung ideas, right? So who were Minjung artists? Did anyone pick up on this? So what I mean, excuse me, what I mean by this is what were their backgrounds? What were the backgrounds of Minjung artists? Charlotte Horlick particularly talked about this because this is kind of interesting about Minjung art, Minjung artists. Were they like the fine artists who grew up rich and with a bunch of artistic education. Yeah, there were small clubs, exactly. Some of them didn't have art experience. Actually, many of them did not, although there were groups. So a lot of them were just students, art students, number one, who were from working class. Yeah, from working class or especially like rural backgrounds. There were some professional artists, right? And there were amateur artists. So artists who didn't have training were also part of this movement. Yes, exactly. And they were rejecting the formal principles, or wanting to reject at least, that they were primarily taught in the academy, right? And so what's the purpose of Minjung art? The Minjung art, there's something really particular that Minjung art evokes or does. Does anyone remember what Charlotte Horlick called this? So it's the social role, right? Remember this, it's the social role. It communicates a political concern. Yeah, there are often people in the images that we're going to look at. Yeah, but what the point of it is that it communicates it communicates a Minjung concern. And so it's this social role of art that we're saying, not just art for art's sake, not just art to look pretty, but it serves a function, right, of communicating politics. Good. Or communicating like the hardship or one of the Minjung concerns is what I said. Good. Yeah, exactly. And that's definitely why some of the art is so powerful, is the artists really did care about what was going on. So there are probably political cartoons that would belong to Minjung art. Minjung art is not by itself in being like political. Not all political, like all art can be political. But Minjung art is particularly communicating like Minjung ideas or ideals associated with the Minjung movement. Does that make sense? So political cartoons could be in Minjung art. I can't really think of any at the moment. People tend to focus on like the woodblock prints and the banners, but I'm sure there were Minjung artists making cartoons particularly. Some of these are very cartoonic, right? Good. All right, so let's work on our describing, especially. So many of us were taken by this artwork here. So let's focus on just what we see in this artwork. What do you see? And you've already looked at this quite a bit, so we should have quite a few things going on. Good. This is a really good example of like a general sentence that gets me as a reader to understand what is there. What Elise says here is workers in a crowded working space. This is a really good general statement on what it is. And now from there, we can kind of go into the details, right? Good. People working hard, workers. Good. And now we get into the details here, like Violet says, there's alcohol, pills, people are hunched over working, right? We'll get to the space in a moment. Yes, coughing up, cough. It looks like this character here. Many of you talked about this figure here. Are they coughing up blood? Are they sneezing? What's going on? Not really sure. It's up to your interpretation. They look tired. They're bleeding. Good. They're very sad. Their hands look broken. Good. So that's all talking about kind of like the icons, right? And who they are. So now we can start thinking about the composition and the style a lot more, right? Because we have this overarching, this is what the artwork illustrates, or what is the subject matter of the artwork, right? So here Keaton says positive and negative space. Yes. So positive, I'm not really sure what positive and negative, what you're thinking in this case, but the positive and negative is the relationship between the heavy black and the heavy white, right? There's this use of these stark contrast between the black and the white, right? That's very good. And then, so that's stylistic, right? Because that's color. And the line, right? That's also the line. There's these thick lines and thin lines, right? And then, so how does that relate? How does that relate to what the artwork conveys? So two-dimensional, yeah, so it's two-dimensional. Yeah, it's two-dimensional. That's good to know. So it creates a sense of space. Good. What else? So it definitely creates a sense of space between the black and the white, right? Maybe an overlaps. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in it. And how they managed to flip it into how they work together is very successful. So I personally think it really helps with the emotion of the piece. You don't have to think that, but I do, right? Because this black and white makes it feel very like drab and very overwhelming in a lot of ways. Helps them feel busy. That's very good. Yeah, makes it feel busy, right? It's that drama. I like that, Ben. Yeah, the drama from the contrast, right? Exactly. Yeah, it feels helpless. So let's talk about that busyness more. So we have overlapping, the two-dimensional overlapping, and then Bella says looks messy and small. So why does it look messy and small? Yes, exactly. We're getting there, right? So how did they do that? How did the artist do that? So to give you a hint, think about the composition. Think about the composition. How is space in this image organized? Good. So there's the stacking. People are stacked on top of each other and they're crowded into small spaces. Yes, exactly. The use of lines here. Yes, Viola, very good. The use of lines. They've carved out these little rooms, right? So you have these big, thick black lines that are going through and they're creating an upper space here and then two lower spaces, right? And then what everyone else is saying here, and notice how the spaces are there, but everyone's overlapping still, right? So that's what is making us get this sense of the overcrowding, right? There's too many people and too much stuff going on for as much space. That's the chaos of it, right? Noise, yes. You can probably even hear, maybe like thinking about the iron and the sewing machines, you can imagine for yourself what this would sound like, right? If you were in there and this person coughing, can you kind of get that feeling of what it would sound like to be in that space, right? Good. Okay. So does that make sense? Do we see how what we see and what we're feeling and what we're thinking it means are related to one another? Yeah. So all of that is on this slide, if you want to go back to it. Good. So yeah, so how is this related to the Minjung movement then? So why are harsh conditions kind of so important? The harsh working conditions. Why would a Minjung artist make this image? And this actually is kind of big, a little bit too big to be distributed. But we can imagine that like a woodblock print this could be distributable. You could definitely make multiple. You can make a lot of them, right? Yes, exactly. It conveys these awful working conditions that people were undergoing. Exactly. Good. So the Minjung goal or concern, I'm going to ask you this question often. What is the Minjung goal or concern? Harsh labor conditions, bringing attention to the fact that these workers are undergoing this hardship, right? And then we just talked about that, right? The way the style and the composition relate to conveying that. That's a lot of the description as well. Yes, exactly. Exactly. The thick and thin line. Yes, good. So, and then how can someone use this? Right, exactly. We already said you can distribute it. You could display it in the gallery. You could distribute it, disseminate it, right? Okay. So just really briefly here, I wanted to talk about the working conditions. So under the Park Chung-hee regime during the 1960s, The economic policy concentrated these government loans for economic development to only a select few existing companies that were family owned and they were already pretty successful. Most of them had already started in during the Japanese colonial period. And these are called jebar in Korean. And je means property and par means like lineage, especially like family lineage. And so you probably already know these companies, right? So they are like Samsung, Hyundai, LG. Under the Park regime's funding, these companies grew exponentially and they became these conglomerates that we know today. And they have their hands in all sorts of sectors of the market, electronics and automobiles. But because these companies and the Park regime were in cahoots with each other, right, to develop economically, it was really difficult for workers to attain the healthy and safe working conditions that they really needed, right? And so, as you can imagine, it was particularly women and children who were the two demographics that who really suffered, and there was especially no protection specifically for these groups. So, and I'm not saying men didn't suffer, but I'm saying that women and children were particularly the people who suffered under these conditions because they had less leeway to get these kinds of good working conditions from the companies. And then this is what really continued into the 1980s, particularly the 1970s, and is why the working conditions were so important. Good. So do these companies control economics and politics in Korea? The answer, my answer would be yes. But you know, I think it depends on who you talk to, whether that's the answer or not. So, I mean, do I think companies in any country control economics and politics? I personally, I do. You may not. That's up to you. All right. Ooh, we're gonna get to that, Elise. We're gonna get to this. That's gonna be our last question of the day. Is we're gonna figure this propaganda issue out. All right. Let's talk about this one here really quickly. So this is tomorrow there will be no farming villages. So what do you see? Let's just talk about that. What do you see? And we're gonna get to the bottom of this one. This one is probably the hardest one to do for a visual analysis because there's so much going on. So what are some things you see? Burgers. Yes, there are definitely burgers. Businessmen, above field workers, workers in a field, coming from a governmental setting. Yeah, I have been trying to figure out what is going on in the middle here for a while. I think it's a representatives assembly. Yes, and they're wearing Western suits. There's the Statue of Liberty rising right out of the center, right? Right. Okay, Ocean. Let's start talking about that. So we got a lot of these random kind of icons going on. Let's talk about the composition of this. So we notice here there's some kind of division going on, right? Between the foreground, between the background, what's going on in the back here, and the foreground. The settings are a little bit different. How would you put into words how this composition is organized? How this background and foreground relate to each other? What do you think? Okay, maybe a timeline. All right, tell me a little bit more. Yeah, how so? The way people facing makes the connection. Series of represent real places. So what is so in the description, we have to be a little bit more specific than it's a timeline or a related. What is the related series of events? What is the relation of events? So compositionally, there's like this division going on here, right? So we have this kind of rural area. Good, yes, the sense of motion, definitely. Yes, there we go. Western world to village Korea, absolutely. Yeah, so we have this division here down the center, and we have the ocean, right, which is where all these symbols that everyone, these icons and that are acting as symbols here of like US influence or foreignness or Westernness, right, with the business, and they're surrounding this kind of looks like a governmental assembly maybe, right, and they're coming into this foreground here, which is where the rural Korea is. And we know, why is rural Korea so important in the Minjung movement? Yes, exactly. You see the ocean all the time in Minjung art to suggest this idea of things coming over from abroad into Korea, right? Yes. Oh, good. Yes, Ratham. The industry is impacting these rural areas. These people in the rural areas are the ones who are suffering or being suffocated by this. And it means, yes, exactly, good. The traditional values, the degradation of these traditional values, right? Very good. Now, one thing I don't really know, or I don't really have an idea about, is why at the bottom here, it's being encroached with these like golf clubs. There's like, I think it might be whiskey, I'm not sure, or gin, one of these kinds of things. So it's up to you, but I think the composition in this one is very important. Yes, there's tons of, yeah, it's kind of like the Western symbols are all on the backs of the rural Koreans, right? Definitely, because the foreground here, what's kind of closer to us as viewers is like rural Korea. It kind of seems like rural Korea is like supporting what's going on above or in the background, right? Very good. Migration to cities. So there's so a lot of students think this one is about the migration to cities. Maybe you can argue it. I don't necessarily think so. I think this one is very much about, yeah, the ideas, the like US culture, particularly coming over and deteriorating and destroying rural Korea. That's what but you know, maybe you can build an argument. So yeah, good question. The big face in the back. I have not been able to identify it, but I think it's supposed to be, it's like a caricature, like something they cut out from like a beauty magazine, and put it, I mean, I think this is supposed to say like different. I'm not sure. I will say, so I have worked on other artworks like this from Minjung art, and I have been able to find the exact source of certain images in these kind of collages, but this one I haven't. So do you think this gaze in the background represents South Korea, or do you think it represents foreign culture in this case, and why? Yeah, probably foreign. I think everything that's like above in this ocean part here in the background is probably like the United States, like foreign culture. Yeah, coming from the ocean. Yeah. Oh, and yeah, let me say, yeah, so the mountains in the background, so you will see Mount Pektu in some Minjung images. Not this one though. Not this one. These I think it's just to create this idea of the horizon, right? Like looming over the ocean. Yeah, good. She's more dressy, yeah. I think so. Let me comment. So the cigarettes and like the whiskey and stuff like that. So cigarettes are not, so it's not that cigarettes themselves are seen as like foreign, because Korean people have cigarettes too, but it's that the certain brands of cigarettes are seen as taking over Korean products, and being used to form bonds with foreign culture. There was a particular movement in the early 1980s and throughout the 1980s that was like using cigarettes from the United States to get Korean people to be interested in US products. And that's where the cigarettes come from. So, because sometimes students say because cigarettes are foreign. The brands actually aren't foreign, but it's just the brand. Yes, there you go. This is very good, Nicholas. Yeah, the brand, we can see this kind of face back here, the brand of Western beauty taking over Korea, maybe, right? That would be a really good interpretation, I think. Good. Okay. And so all of this is on here too, if you want to look for your realization. So yeah, so the Minjun concern is we've been talking about it, foreign traditional, good, and then the composition, right? There's this kind of ocean versus rural Korea, right? Foreign versus Korean. Okay, so what we're gonna do for the plenary session today is you're actually, not plenary session, the plenary response is a comparative visual analysis. So this is different from just one artwork. So I'm going to start by saying that very obviously it's a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot different. So the most important thing about a comparative visual analysis is that you need to make sure that what you're writing about is how the two artworks compare to one another. So you're going to be a really good comparative visual analysis uses sentences that say like, artwork A has this, but artwork B has this. Artwork A looks like this. However, artwork B looks like this. Okay. So I get a lot of students who, the one thing that I tell students to do, and we're going to practice, so it's okay, but is to not do, is talk about artwork A in one paragraph and say, artwork A is this. Artwork A looks like this. Artwork A is about this. And then talk about the other artwork in a second paragraph. Artwork B is this. Artwork B looks like this. Artwork B has this, okay? Why is that not comparative? Why is if I just talk about artwork A and then I just talk about artwork B, why is that not a comparative visual analysis? What do you think? Just off the bat. No connection. Exactly. So the purpose of the comparative visual analysis is to build a connection between the two. That is perfectly stated. Yeah, and yes, there's no immediate comparisons. Exactly. There's a difference between the two right here. It's not just this is one artwork, this is another artwork. It is how they're related to one another, how they connect to one another. Very good. All right. So we're going to talk about these two artworks. So let's just look at this one first, and let's just say some things that we see about it. Okay, this is not necessarily what you would be writing in your visual analysis, but this is a good way to start, is just to look at one and then the other. Right, so let's look at this one. So what are some things that you see, or some things that stand out to you about this one? It's very bright. It's very busy. It's very joyful. Very good. There's people doing a lot of different things. Good. Bright colors, many figures. Yes. What about Minjung's, like Minjung related things? What do you think? Minjung related things. Dancing, working together, people coming together. Yes, very important there. Yeah. So this banner says unification of the people is basically what it says, kind of. Minjok is a different word that's different. It's different than Minjung, but yeah, unification of the people united. In the middle, people are hugging and crying. Very good. Types of people. Yeah, all different types of people right here. Are these people rural? Are they traditional? Are they modern? Do they look like they're elites? Do they look like they're working class? And what makes you say that? Yeah, all sorts of different people. I do think that this one personally, for me, I think there's more to like kind of this capturing traditional Korea, particularly in rural Korea. Because you have like oh my gosh, I just forgot what these Jed, do you know what is the name for when you have the hat that spins? Is it like sangnori or something like that? I can't remember. This particular hats that spin. Yeah, okay, yeah, sangnori. Yeah, it's more working class, I think. Good. So what do you think this one is about then? Jae actually had it. Jae said sangno. Yeah, there we go. Sangnori. Thank you. Yeah, this is called 상모놀이. This is very important because 상모놀이 is all about getting excited, getting the particularly it's in shamanism, getting the spirits excited. But yeah, good. So there's this like traditional kind of pre-modern Korean dance thing going on down here too. So Jess says unification between North and South. Right. Good. I think so too. Whenever you see unification like this, it's usually North and South is what they're going for, right? Okay. All right. And then let's talk about this one. What do we see? What do we see in this one? A city. Good. So where is the city? Sad faces. Where are the sad faces? Who has the sad faces? Leading capitalism and happy villagers. Where? In what parts? It's darker. Darker in what part? Background. Yes, good. No need to apologize. Yes, so we have this background here is the city, and then here in the foreground we have the happy villagers, right? Good. Yeah, these two people especially look really miserable here at the top. I think some people said, I'm not completely certain, but as people said in their blogs, this is probably bricklayer. And then I think this might be a cook, but they might also be doing laundry. I'm not completely certain. And then what do you think this person's doing here? What do you think this? Yes, sewing. This is a sewing machine. It's also kind of given away because that was very much a woman's or a young adolescent girl's job. Good. Yes. So the meaning behind it, the Minjun concern is migration makes people sad. Yeah. So again, do you see how there's this dichotomy between the background and the foreground in many of these images, right? And we see in the foreground here, we have the happy villagers. They're in the hometown. And then in the background, we have these people who are in the urban center, right? And they're suffering, right? So divide between classes, yeah. Divide between the cities and rural villages. Exactly, good. Yeah, and there's butterflies here. Butterflies are kind of a universal symbol of what? If there's butterflies flying around, then it's probably very what? Happiness. Yeah, very happy, very peaceful, I would say. Very nature, happy, peaceful, yeah. Good. Okay. So now this is the kind of stuff you're going to write for your comparative visual analysis. Okay. So let's compare some of their like descriptive differences. So let's talk about like mediums, icons, composition styles. So what are some similarities? Oh, what are some similarities between the two already that you can see? What are some similarities? They're both woodblock prints. Very good. Very important. They are both woodblock prints. Good. That is a great similarity. They are both the same artist. Yes, they are the same artist. Sometimes that will happen. And that's actually part of the reason why I picked these two for today. They both have people. Yes, this is very good. They both have people in them. It sounds very basic, but that's very important, right? Yes, they do have similar characters, right? They have rural people are a part of both, right? There are butterflies in both. Yes, there are butterflies in both. That's very important. That is that symbol of happiness and joy, right? Yes, there's lots of emotion in both. Lots of different emotions in both. Good. So the same artist, well, friends, color. What about the colors between the two? Do you think they're similar or different? They're a little bit different. I think it might just be the images, but I think the parents and siblings in the hometown, the colors are a little bit more like diluted or something, which kind of makes it watery, but they're very bright, yeah, saturated in releasing the grief for unification. Yeah. Good. And both show, like I said, the characters are similar, yeah. Warm tones. Yeah, the one on the right is very warm. Good. And they both use heavy lines. We didn't quite talk about this. But notice how like the lines are what's used to kind of shape the characters, right? Line, without the lines, we wouldn't really be able to tell what anything was in this, right? And that's kind of a part of woodblock printing generally, not always, but generally speaking. So there's this emphasis on line. Yes, good. And they're kind of cartoonish a little bit too, right? Which is kind of the style of the artist here. This artist style with these kind of cartoonish figures is very present in both. All right, how are they different? Yes, mokuhanga, mokpanhwa is what it's called in Korean. Mokuhanga is what it's called in Japanese. Woodblock printing, good. So how are the two different? What do you think? I came up with a few differences. So let me say the composition between the two, I think counts as different. So how are the compositions different? Yes, this is a good one. So the one on the left is kind of more flat. The one on the right is kind of has that strong foreground background. Yes, good. This is another big difference between the two, right? The spiral, there's this circularness, this spiral going on in the composition of this artwork, right? On the left, this releasing the grief. Whereas this artwork on the right, parents and siblings in the hometown, is more linear. Very good. Yeah, that's a huge difference. That's what I said. What else did I say? Oh, and many of us said this too. Like there's kind of this white background versus there's like an obvious setting. Yeah, that's very good, Riddy, too. Yeah, so the characters in this right one here are actually like directing their perspective. They're looking at the viewer, but on the releasing the grief, they're not at all. They're more focused on each other, right? That is very good, yeah. Ooh, this is the interpretive difference, Maddie. Yes, interpretive difference. So let's look at that. Yeah, so their meanings or messages. So we've kind of talked about this. Importance of rural Korea pre-modern, Korean traditional culture, importance of family. So the difference is here. Yeah, did I put that one? Yes, okay, good. Unity versus division is different between these two, right? So in this one here, everyone's uniting together, right? Or in this one, people are divided. That's a huge that's a very different, it's very different, right? Good. All right. And then the Minjung goal are concern. So is the Minjung goal or concern similar or different? So rural Korea, the division between city and country, unification of North and South. What do you think? Similar or different? Yeah, they do have a different sense of movement. I said that on the previous slide too, yeah. Sorry. Stop. Stacked versus spiraled, yeah. All right. Yeah, they are pretty similar despite the different tones in each piece. Okay, so we have 2 minutes here. Oh yeah, reunification versus work. Okay, so this is the prompt for your after class the plenary session response. So you're going to choose any of the 2 of the 4 Minjung artworks that we discuss in class, and you also discuss for your blog. So night shift, parents and siblings in the hometown. Tomorrow there will be no farming villages, or releasing the grief for unification. And you're going to write. Do not choose the 2 that we just did the comparison for. Parents and siblings in the hometown and releasing grief for unification. Don't choose those 2. But conduct a comparative visual analysis of the 2 artworks that you choose. Remember to describe both their similarities and differences. I will also say this, a lot of students forget to talk about how they're similar, especially when you pick 2 that are very different from one another. So remember to describe both, and then talk about their mediums, their icons, their composition and style. So here's the question, comparative interpret which Minjung concerns, goals, or themes do the 2 communicate? How are their meanings related or relevant to each other or not? Do they successfully communicate these messages or not, and why? And you need at least 1 citation to Horlick, Stiller, or Robinson. 250, 300 words. Most important thing, use comparison words. Okay, we got that? Are there any questions about the prompt here? Okay, and this is on Canvas too, on the plenary session response submission portal. Good. All right. So what do you think? I think Elise brought this up, right? What is the difference between North Korean art as propaganda and Minjung art as political? Why are they different? Why is one propaganda and one is just political? Ratham, if you want to pick an artwork from the Horlick reading or that Maya or Dr. Stiller showed, I'm fine with that as well. I will say that you will see the artworks from the Zoom session again on the exam, so which is coming up next week. So okay, well, we don't have time. So I don't know. This is just my choice. Oh, if you need to go, you can go. Yeah, so this is just my thing, but or my opinion. I think it kind of depends on it just really depends on your perspective, right? We tend to view North Korean art as propaganda because it's trying to support a dictatorship, right? But then we tend to view Minjung art as just political art because it's about democracy, right? And ensuring labor rights and like stuff that we're like, yeah, this is really good, right? So it's really just your political consciousness. Because I mean, if you think about it, not every art that's political has a call to action the way that I think propaganda does, or way that propaganda the propaganda functions. But in a lot of ways, Minjung art does have that call to action, right? So this is kind of the relationship between the two. So good. Okay. Yeah, if you need to go, just go. If you're someone who needs to talk to me after this class, please stay and talk to me, ask me a question. Let me take this down. Stop this. Thank you all. Okay, Keaton, I know you need to talk to me. Jared, do you need to talk to me too? Or are you just stuck?
No, I was looking at your background actually. I remember learning about that in my
Oh yes, Chikori.
yeah.
Yes,
Anyway.
yes, this they are like the original backgrounds basically, so that's why
Yeah.
I'm like that way.
Cool. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
See you next week. Bye.
Hi, Keaton. Hi, I can't hear you. No. Let me get. Oh, here, let me